I know in the last year, you and Ricky Solinger have released this fantastic book that I'm looking forward to reading the full book. I've read excerpts of it, Reproductive Justice and Introduction. And I want to really spend some time on that, because it seems to me that when we talk about issues of women's reproductive freedom and abortion access and the full range of women's reproductive health, the assumption sometimes, even on the so-called left or among progressive people, is that we assume we're all talking about the same thing. But there really is a difference, isn't there, between the way that some folks talk about these issues and the way that other people do. And it seems to me that divide is often rooted in issues of race and class. So talk a little bit about that, if you could, historically, the way these things are framed and why those framings can sometimes be problematic, and why you have chosen to talk about this as an issue of reproductive justice as opposed to, let's say, reproductive choice, reproductive freedom, some of the terms that other people use. What are the differences and why do they matter?
In 1994, Hillary Clinton was leading a healthcare reform campaign on behalf of her husband. And somehow the Democratic Party as a whole thought that if they omitted mentioning reproductive health care from healthcare reform, they could somehow slide it past the Republicans.
Yeah.
Well, how well do you think that worked?
It did not, clearly.
But we Black women, 12 of us Black women, were in Chicago hearing about this plan, and we had our WTF moment. Like, excuse me, reproductive health care is the main driver of any woman to a doctor. So if you're going to omit reproductive health care, you're basically offering us a male-centered health care plan you want us women to support. That wasn't going to fly for us 12 Black women. So we decided to form a coalition, put an ad in the Washington Post to say no, and we coined the term reproductive justice in that moment by splicing together reproductive rights, which basically focuses on abortion rights, but saying, no, we need social justice too, because it's social justice issues that help women determine if they're ready to become a parent or not. And so we spliced together reproductive rights and social justice and coined reproductive justice, not only to serve as an ad for that Washington Post ad in 1994, but it served to spark a whole new way of organizing among women of color, because we said it's about abortion, but it's beyond abortion. It's about health care and living wages and environmental justice and the school to prison pipeline and Black Lives Matter. It's about a whole lot more. And once we started organizing our movement of women of color using this new framework, what we discovered was that the more radical wing of the white women's movement was attracted to our framework, because they had also been very frustrated by the paralysis of the pro-life, pro-choice debate, only focusing on abortion and ignoring all the other issues that women and families have to deal with. And so without us intending it, reproductive justice took on a life of its own, eventually started eclipsing discussions around pro-choice, pro-life, because there were people who were on both sides who could understand and resonate with the fact that all pregnancies should be wanted. And if a woman has a planned pregnancy, but she doesn't have health care, if she doesn't have job security, if she's experiencing violence, that planned wanted pregnancy may become an unwanted pregnancy. And then maybe an unplanned pregnancy where the person just got caught by surprise, but then did an assessment and say, okay, I'm ready. This is my time. I've got health care. We won't be financially stressed. My other children are okay. I'm going to turn this unplanned pregnancy into a wanted pregnancy. That's kind of how people actually make those decisions. And so the politics of trying to just start with the pregnancy never made sense to us, because you got to go upstream and look what's happening in people's lives as these pregnancies come along. And that's what reproductive justice calls attention to. Because it came from African American women, we define white supremacy and neoliberalism as the largest threats to people being able to make autonomous reproductive decisions, because those are the things that threaten the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent your children in safe and healthy environments, which is the core definition of reproductive justice.
Well, I think that's so powerful because, we do get stuck in these dichotomies of pro-choice and anti-choice, or what they want to call themselves pro-life. But like you said, there are folks on the side that are frankly restrictionist, if not abolitionist, when it comes to abortion. And they are not on the side that most of us on the left certainly consider our side. And yet there are people within that camp who could be very open to the idea that women have to have the kinds of choices that allow them to make decisions about when to have children, and when they do choose to have children, have those children healthy and in a position to actually raise them. And obviously, one of the things about that that's so important is that it really allows us to, I think, on a political level, not to be cynical or think about it only in that way, but I think it allows us to tell who are the people on that anti-abortion, anti-choice, whatever term we use, side, who are really just about controlling women in an obvious patriarchal, misogynistic way, and those who actually give a damn about women's health and women's freedom. Because we need to know who's who, right? I mean, there are people on that side who are clearly have no interest in empowering women at all. And then there are those who talk as if they do, but yet they're still on this highly reactionary tip currently. And I think with the reproductive justice frame, you allow us to sort of break that dichotomy a bit. How have you found that framing to have affected the larger discourse? First, let's say with regard to some of the traditional white-dominated liberal reproductive choice organizations, and then how has it played, or has it really had any impact on some of the anti-choice abortion restrictionist folks, in your estimation?
I think it's impacted people on both sides of the discourse. As I said, we've become the gravitational node for, I think, the reproductive health rights and justice movement, because more and more people are using it and sometimes trying to even co-opt our frame on the left. So I think we've had a decided impact on that. On the right, I think we've also provided a talking point. Is you read my latest book, Radical Reproductive Justice, I actually have several essays in there by people who self-define as pro-lifers using the reproductive justice framework. And so they have defined for themselves the common ground that they see with those of us who are supporting abortion rights, but at the same time supporting more broadly women's human rights. And so I think we've made some inroads there.
On that issue of white supremacy, it's a very tricky ideology, and it has all kinds of ways of weaving itself into people's narrative and understanding of issues, including the issue of reproductive justice. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, because it's been so pernicious and also so common in the last several years, is the way in which some of the folks who would roll back women's reproductive freedoms, justice, access to various forms of reproductive health care have couched particularly their anti-abortion narrative in the politics of racial ecumenism and equity. The folks who were out there saying, abortion is genocide against black people. And it's a very cynical use of racial justice terminology and concepts. And these, of course, are reactionary people usually doing this who have never really demonstrated a significant amount of concern for actual genocide against black and brown bodies, but they're using it in this case. Could you talk a little bit about where that comes from, what it's really about, and how do folks arm themselves against the manipulation of those really legitimate concerns that black communities have about the way that they have been used and they have been experimented on and they have been manipulated? How do we arm ourselves against the use of that for ends that are really quite in line with white supremacy in so many ways, as well as misogyny and patriarchy?
We had to deal with this in 2010 when these billboards first went up around Atlanta, basically saying that black children are an endangered species. I wrote about it in my latest book. And what that basically was saying is that black women are committing genocide against the black race, they claim, because we were choosing to exercise reproductive control. Now, that's not an original thought. That is something Marcus Garvey said in the 1920s. He didn't say it quite as rudely, but he thought that we should overbreed ourselves as a response to white supremacy. So that's not an original thought by any means. But this billboard attack was very unusual. What it turned out is that black surrogates had been used by the white anti-abortion movement to create this myth that black women were being coerced into having abortions because of the race of the child. Now, the myth fell apart when we pointed out that you could never find a black woman who was choosing an abortion because she was surprised that her child was going to be black. So we wondered whether we were the real targets of this advertising campaign, or was it designed to make white people feel guilty about supporting abortion for fear of being defined as racist if they do. It really was a very well thought out, manipulative message that you could not read on its surface because it just did not make sense on its surface. But it also accompanied bills in state legislatures that empowered or even required doctors to inquire about the motives of women seeking abortion, mainly women of color seeking abortion, because white women were never asked, are you having an abortion because of the race or the gender of the child? It was always directed towards African American or Asian American women, this accusation that we could have been having abortions because of the race or the gender of the child. So it set doctors up to, for the first time, question a woman's motive for seeking a service. And that was very unusual because heretofore, doctors' questions were restricted to medical ones. When was your last menstrual period? Not, why are you having this service? And so they were trying to write into law a requirement that doctors get into women's motives. We don't think it was, again, to help there be more black or Asian babies in America. It was to write into law the obligation of doctors to serve as judges on women's motives for seeking abortions, which of course would have then been amplified and expanded to affect white women, because there are some people who say you shouldn't have an abortion just to continue your education. You shouldn't have an abortion just to not be poor. You'll figure out a way. You shouldn't have an abortion if you've been raped. You'll figure it out. I mean, there are all kinds of people who make judgments about women having abortion. And so they were trying to use black people as a way to write into being a regulation that would then allow them to better control white women.
And I think your point is really well taken, that whole idea of, the most dangerous place for a black child is in its mother's womb. That was clearly aimed at white people. I mean, that was aimed at the emotional nerve center of white people to get them, I think, to believe that by being against abortion, you're actually taking a stance for racial justice. Yes, for racial justice. So it helps to assuage some of that guilt. It allows some white liberals, hope in their mind, to be peeled off. And it also,
for racists to declare themselves civil rights champions.
Right.
Because the sponsors of all of this legislation are the people in Congress who have opposed every civil rights act that's come across their desk.